Hello again, everyone. Louis Setti speaking as the Blue Ridge Reporter with yet another presentation designed particularly for Christians, especially Christian parents, about what Ron Paul actually stands for, positions they may be unaware of. I contend they should find these views of Ron Paul shocking and exclude him from consideration by Christians, and in fact be a reason to oppose the general philosophy of libertarianism, which is very appealing to our young people. And even beyond Ron Paul's political career, this movement portends great evil for our country, our homes, and our family. But regarding this presentation, I urge you and recommend you to go to YouTube when you're done with this presentation, perhaps, and type in John Stossel, Stossell. He's a network newsman. John Stossel. Put that in the YouTube search bar. John Stossel interviews Ron Paul, and that took place in the year 2007. December 7th. It's part 1. At about 2 minutes into that interview, Stossel asks libertarian Ron Paul, should gays be allowed to be married? And Ron Paul said, quote, sure, they can do whatever they want, and they can call it whatever they want, close quote. That's his position. He went on to say that homosexuals can't, quote, can't make me personally accept what they do, close quote. But then his basic, the background of all this is his view that let them do what they want, get married, call it whatever you want to call it. But that's something that would be just fine with him. In fact, he casually used the phrase, sure. So let's take a look at that. And more about what Ron Paul pointed out that he thinks marriage should be strictly a church issue. I agree. He thinks there should be no state license needed to get married. I agree. He said that happened, licensing by the state for marriage, about 100 years ago. That's essentially my understanding. However, he went on to say, so if the church wants to define marriage, and the church should define marriage, and it should simply be a church matter, then his logic, and this is where it's particularly faulty, I think, historically speaking, which is not like Ron Paul, at least as I know him, because he concludes that as long as the church defines a marriage to be between anybody who wants to get married and call it what you will, then that's just fine, because it's a church definition. Well, we Christians who hold to the Westminster Confession of Faith and other Christians would recognize that not every institution that puts a cross on the roof and calls itself a church is in fact a church. The Westminster Confession, as I recall, called some of them synagogues of Satan. They've apostatized so far away from what the Scripture teaches that, to use a non-theological term, it's a joke. They're not really churches. They're institutions that want to espouse a particular view under the name of a Christian church because of the prestige and influence the church still carries. As Christ said, many will come in my name. So 100 years ago, there wasn't an issue about homosexuals being married, at least under the auspices of any evenly remotely considered possibility in the Christian church. It was simply not an issue. So when Ron Paul refers to the issue simply being one for the church, and then draws from that the church may conclude that homosexuals can get married, it's a church issue after all, not a state issue, he's wrong about that concept, because the Bible's quite clear, one man, one woman. The Lord made Adam, then the Lord made Eve to be his helper, etc. The Bible's clear about homosexuality, Old Testament, New Testament. We've been through this before. In fact, Ron Paul should know that as a professing Christian, but also know it as a intelligent, learned man. Because 100 years ago, even less, there were sodomy laws in the various states prohibiting sodomy. Sodomy was a crime. So how could Ron Paul say that going back 100 years ago, when the church alone decided what was a marriage and defined what was a marriage, that a homosexual marriage would be approvable today by a church, but 100 years ago, using his frame of reference, the state has sodomy laws. So that was an exclusion from the possibility of marriage because of the homosexual nature, in fact, essence of sodomy. So Ron Paul, I think, got things confused. It is strictly a church issue, but if he used the biblical understanding, the biblical explicit nature of the Bible's view of homosexuality, one can see that it could never be there can never be a marriage between homosexuals or lesbians. Certainly not endorsed by any view of Scripture, when both Old and New Testament make it clear that such people are not going to see the kingdom of heaven. Apostle Paul said that in his epistles. But nevertheless, Ron Paul, professing Christians, answered the question, should gays be married? He said, sure, hey, what's the big deal? So I think he's way off base on that, and that's a reason to consider Ron Paul politically an anathema. Christians should simply stay away from him and do what they can to advise other Christians and, in fact, oppose this growing influence of libertarian thinking regarding the issues of social issues. Thank you very much. This is Lou Rossetti, the Blue Ridge Report.